Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the deep, incredibly complex, and enduring history of Native Americans in the United States. And look, this isn't just a story about the distant past, right? It's a massive, sweeping narrative of absolute resilience, brilliant innovation, and profound adaptation that spans literally thousands of years. So let's just jump right in. But first, before we even look at our roadmap, I want you to ask yourself a question. How far back does the American story actually go? Because, for a long time, popular narratives have kind of just started the clock in the year 1492. But honestly, that perspective completely misses thousands of years of rich, complex human civilizations that were thriving here long before any European ships ever crossed the Atlantic. All right, so here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to cover 1. Ancient civilizations and cultures. 2. European contact and devastation. 3. Expansion, treaties, and removal. 4. Assimilation and native resistance. And finally, 5. The era of self-determination. Okay, part 1. Ancient civilizations and cultures. Let's literally step back to the very earliest stages of human history on the continent. Human history here in the Americas stretches back thousands and thousands of years. We're talking about early populations migrating across the Bering Land Bridge from Eurasia, and human development here evolved through some very distinct cultural stages. It kicked off with the Lithic era. Think megafauna hunters with incredibly crafted spear points. Then, as the climate stabilized around 3000 BCE, we see the Archaic stage emerge with complex hunter-gatherer societies, and that eventually evolved straight through the formative and classic stages, right into the highly structured agricultural societies of the post-classic period around 1200 CE. Just to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of these early societies, take a look at this number, 30,000. By the year 1250 CE, the Mississippian culture had built Cahokia. This was a massive urban center in present-day Illinois, and at its peak, it supported up to 30,000 people. It had over 100 vast earthen mounds. One of them, Monk's Mound, is a 10-story structure with a perimeter that literally rivals the Great Pyramid of Egypt. I mean, this was a thriving metropolis that was the same size as major European cities at the exact same time in history. And while that was happening, over in the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloanians were showing just incredible sophistication. They lived in the Four Corners region, and they adapted to this really harsh environment by building grand, multi-story cliff dwellings. They also set up expansive trade networks all across the Colorado Plateau. When you look at sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, you're looking at unbelievable architectural prowess and a super deep understanding of astronomy and agriculture. Moving on to part 2, European contact and devastation. Starting in the 15th century, the arrival of European explorers completely and tragically reshaped the Americas. So the most devastating impact of European contact, it wasn't actually military, it was biological. The introduction of Eurasian diseases, which indigenous peoples had absolutely no immunity to, caused just catastrophic mortality rates. Take the smallpox epidemic in Massachusetts Bay between 1618 and 1619. It wiped out up to 90% of the native population there. 90%. This staggering loss of life caused profound breakdowns in societal structures, and it deeply, deeply disrupted how knowledge and culture were passed down through generations. Now, European contact also brought about the Columbian Exchange, right? This introduced new plants and animals to the continent. And a massive game changer here was the reintroduction of the horse to North America. It profoundly transformed the cultures of the Great Plains. Native nations rapidly integrated horses into their everyday lives, which drastically expanded their hunting ranges, especially for bison, and totally revolutionized their trade networks and military mobility. Okay, part 3, expansion, treaties, and removal. Let's fast forward a bit to the 19th century, where the newly formed United States begins aggressively expanding its territory. You've probably heard the term manifest destiny. This was the 19th century ideology that basically justified U.S. territorial expansion across North America as something that was just obvious, certain, and meant to be. But in practice, this ideology was used to rationalize taking lands that were already occupied, and it led to a brutal series of coerced treaties, broken promises, and intense military pressure on native nations. The crucial point to understand here is the stark clash of worldviews. It's like two completely different planets. On one side, Native American societies were built around communal landholding, deep spiritual ties to the land, and fiercely preserving their sovereignty. On the flip side, U.S. government policy was aggressively pushing for private property, rapid westward expansion, and the forced assimilation or relocation of indigenous peoples. And this clash eventually culminated in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This policy systematically forced over 100,000 Native Americans off their ancestral lands in the East, pushing them into designated territory west of the Mississippi. And let's be clear, this was not voluntary. It was forced by the military, and it resulted in unimaginable tragedies. The most well-known is the Trail of Tears, a horrific forced march where an estimated 4,000 Cherokee people died from exposure, disease, and starvation. Which brings us to part 4, assimilation and native resistance. Through all of this dispossession, Native Americans actively fought to maintain their identities. Despite facing these severe systemic injustices, Native Americans were still deeply involved in major national events. A really powerful example is General Ali S. Parker, a Seneca leader who actually served as Ulysses S. Grant's military secretary during the Civil War. Get this, he drafted the final surrender terms that Robert E. Lee signed at Appomattox in 1865. When Lee told him he was glad to see one real American in the room, Parker famously replied, "We are all Americans." But even with that level of service, the path to basic U.S. citizenship for Native Americans was incredibly fragmented. Citizenship was granted piecemeal. Sometimes it was through specific treaties, sometimes through military service, or even through assimilationist policies like the Dawes Act. It actually wasn't until 1924, with the Blanket Indian Citizenship Act, that all Native Americans born within the U.S. were formally recognized as citizens. Finally, Part 5, the era of self-determination. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, we see a huge pivotal shift toward renewed activism and reclaiming Indigenous sovereignty. A massive catalyst for this shift? World War II. During the war, 44,000 Native Americans served in the military. This was a completely voluntary, huge mobilization. And what happened was, this experience exposed many Native Americans to life outside the reservation system. It ended up fostering new skills and perspectives that would massively influence the civil rights activism we'd see in the following decades. And right after the war, we see this huge demographic shift, spurred by federal policies and economic opportunities. Native Americans transitioned from being mostly rural to highly urbanized. Look at this trend. In 1940, only 8% lived in urban areas. By 1970, it jumped to 45%. And by 2012, a striking 70% of Native Americans lived in cities. This migration helped create powerful intertribal communities that fueled the pan-Indian civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. So all of this, decades of really hard-fought activism, finally led to landmark legislation. In 1975, the government passed the Indian Self-Determination Act. This formally ended those disastrous past termination policies. It recognized tribal autonomy and finally allowed Native nations to manage their own programs and economic initiatives. It was a completely crucial victory for Indigenous self-determination. Wow, okay, we've covered a ton of ground today, from the architectural marvels of ancient civilizations to the modern resilience of Native nations. And remember, this is a continuously unfolding story of survival, adaptation, and sovereignty. So I want to leave you with this final thought. How does understanding these thousands of years of deep history reshape your view of the American story today? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep exploring.